Peter, just in the last couple seasons of filming Wild Kingdom with you, one thing we've encountered that we don't talk enough about is all of the darn insects that we experience when we're out in the field. I mean, some of them bite, some of them sting, some of them burrow in your skin. God, it can be too much.
I mean, we're just food for, seems like every insect out there, from ticks to mosquitoes to every flying insect. And then along come bats. Bats are our friend, devouring millions of them every night. So if you hate mosquitoes, you've got to love bats.
We've done an episode about bats, and I learned so much. But ever since, I've been making sure to kind of notice bats at dusk when they fly around, wherever I am.
I do too. I used to teach my children when we were camping as it got dusky near the water that they could see the bats darting around, reminding them they're finding these insects with echolocation. Imagine that. It's sort of like dolphins do in the water. Incredible species, this little flying mammal that we absolutely have to save. I'm Peter Gross, wildlife expert and educator.
And I'm wildlife ecologist Dr. Rae Grant. This is Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, the podcast. Episode 4, Bats.
In a recent episode of Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom Protecting the Wild, Rae and I traveled to Texas. While we were there, I visited a couple who built a bat preserve in their own backyard to rehabilitate bats that had been sick or injured. One night at dusk, we went to the Congress Avenue Bridge to release them back into the wild so they could rejoin one of the largest bat colonies in the world.
Wow, here they come. Look at this.
Wow. Oh my gosh, look at that. No way. That gathering at the bridge is a local phenomenon. Austin residents and visitors gather on the bridge every night to watch more than 1 million bats fly from the bridge out to hunt for food. It was honestly like the guests were waiting for a fireworks show. But sadly, not all bat species in Texas are thriving. I had a poignant moment when I went looking for bats deep inside Gorman Cave with biologist Dr. Nate Fuller.
There should be hundreds of bats here, maybe even thousands of bats. We should have heard them as we were walking up to the gate, and there's nothing here right now, which is not good. This is an old pile of bat guano. This used to be an active colony. They should be flying around and hitting us in the face and going absolutely mental right now, but nobody's home.
Nate's an expert on the disease that's ravaging the bat population both inside Gorman Cave and across the U.S.
White nose syndrome is a fungal disease that first appeared in upstate New York in the winter of 2006-2007. It affects bats while they hibernate. It's a cutaneous fungal disease. It grows on their skin is what that means, and it eats away at their skin membrane, causing a bunch of very strange physiological responses that more or less cause bats to wake up too often from hibernation, such that they burn through all their fat too quickly and they die. It's wiped out a number of important hibernation sites or dropped the population down by 90-95% in a lot of places.
We talked to Nate not only about what's harming the bats, but about why bats are worth protecting. He gave us quite a story of how he got interested in bats in the first place.
I do like to say that the bats chose me. When I was young, I was convinced I was going to be a biologist. My mom was a biologist studying fish and studying lakes and aquatic plants, and I decided I'm going to be a biologist. And I always liked the weird. I always liked the unique. I like the things that did funny stuff, the unexpected, right? And so for me, bats happened because I was a undergraduate, and there was an advertisement sent around the department that said, hey, this company is hiring surveyors for bats because there's lots of endangered bat surveys that are done mostly up in the Northeast. Oh, I get paid to go camping and stay up all night and catch bats? That sounds like a lot of fun. And so I signed up for it. I did it. I went camping all around Pennsylvania. We stayed up all night catching bats. And so I had already signed up for a graduate program at a different university, and it was going to be studying mosquito ecology or entomology in some capacity. And it turns out that program didn't work out for me. And I actually left a PhD program, which a lot of people say, don't do that. It's not good for your career, whatever. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. But also you have to make decisions that are best for you when the time comes. And so I left that program and I went back to the bat job. And I happened to find a guy named Tom Coons at Boston University, who I actually didn't know at the time because I wasn't so much a bat person, just somebody who was interested in bats, that he is the bat guy. Tom Coons was one of the luminaries of the field. And so we were in New York State somewhere, and we randomly caught an endangered bat. And when you catch an endangered bat during these surveys, you have to put a transmitter on its back, a little radio transmitter, and then you followed around for 10 days listening for the beeps. And so that project was, I go to work at 6 p.m., I come home at 6 a.m., rinse and repeat for 10 days. And I like to say that the bats chose me because I got into bats sort of backwards, in the sense I got a job and I was doing something I loved. And then I got into it, and you fall in love with them. They're wonderful little animals that it's fun to do the field work. It's fun to think about their behaviors, their ecology, their physiology. And eventually I became an expert in white nose syndrome, and that became one of the biggest questions of the past 15 years. And here we are.
So often we get questions about bats and why are they important, and all the misconceptions about how they can affect people. What would you tell people to clear those stories up about fear of bats and diseases and that sort of thing?
On a typical day, you're not going to interact with a bat. And I think in North America, there aren't really any diseases that bats carry that aren't already carried by plenty of other organisms. So they're not unique in the sense that they are reservoirs for disease. That's just something that mammals do, and in a lot of ways people do it too. I think that there's a place to be cautious. There are things that we don't understand going on in the ecology of these animals and the ecosystem around them. So yes, they can harbor disease.
I have to say, biologist to biologist, sometimes studying an animal involves studying its poop. And so I'm curious about bat poop.
Yeah, and I have lots of memories attached. Like, people think it smells really gross. For me, it's one of the best smells in the world because it's like, oh yeah, this, it's how your sense of smell is attached to these deep memories. And just like some of the best times of my life were when I was waist deep in bat poop.
This is what makes you, Nate.
So yes, collectively we call it guano. Guano is actually a mixture of urine and feces. So there's a guano pile underneath where the bats are that has urine, which is the nitrogenous liquid waste, and then there's feces, which is the solid waste. Those fall and they mix. And the benefits of it are multi-level. So you've got cave ecosystems that are fully dependent on bat poop a lot of the time. So you see these huge insect communities that are just fully based on them processing bat guano. There's also bat guano is a very well-known and very effective fertilizer. It has lots. It's very rich in nitrogen. People actually still commercially mine it in Texas.
Wait, it's an industry. There's an industry around mining guano.
I'm not kidding when I say this, Ray. There are guano rustlers who will clandestinely go into caves and vacuum it up and run off under the cover of darkness, like steal guano out of caves because you can sell it for a good amount of money.
There's a bat guano black market. My. See, this is why we really got you on the podcast, just to give us the real deal.
Interesting.
The criminal behavior around bat poop.
Yeah, I hope I don't get my thumbs broken for saying something like that.
Nate, we are geeking out about bats, and we're talking to you about bats. So we're calling you the bat guy, and we had a bat episode. But, bats are not one species, right? Tell us about the diversity within bats and, maybe some of the extremes when we talk about different species.
This is one of my favorite questions of all time.
Yay,
I really like, and it's one of those where I wish there was a video component to this because I could really illustrate what it looks like. But bats come in all shapes and sizes. They're wildly diverse, and we think it has a lot to do with the fact that they evolved about 55 million years ago when there was this open ecosystem out there, which is nocturnal aerial insectivore. And so like there's nothing flying back in prehistory. There's nothing flying around at night. that's eating things that are in the sky. And so bats found a way to exploit that niche. And from there, they diversified into all kinds of different things.
Ooh, they're smarty pants.
Yeah, the smallest bat out there is a bumblebee bat, which if you Google it, I don't know, it's about the size of the distal portion of your thumb, that last joint of your thumb. I think they weigh about 1 gram. They're really tiny. The largest bat is the Malaysian fruit bat, which has a wingspan that's 6 feet long, which is as wide as my arms.
You are kidding. Not 6 feet.
6 feet, yeah. I think they're probably a little shorter wingspan than Peter is tall, but it would be a pretty close race right there.
Oh my goodness. So from thumbnail size to 6 feet.
Yeah. And those are the flying foxes, right? And those are fruit bats. There's bats that will display, they have like a mohawk they just have a weird patch of hair on their heads that turns into a mohawk that they use to display to females. There's bats that are pure white that make tents. They go under leaves and they chew the leaves along the rib so that the leaf falls down, and they make these temporary roosts that are called tents. There are bats that eat fish. There are bats that eat frogs.
Bats that go fishing.
Yes, but instead of using their mouth, they drag their feet through the water. And you see these animals. So the bats that you saw at the cave in Texas, those were also a Myotis species. And that's it's a very diverse genus of bat. And they all kind of have the same body form. But this fishing Myotis has huge grappling hook looking feet. So evolution has pushed them such that they drag their feet across the water and they'll scoop up fish that are hanging on the surface. Then they pull it up to their mouth and they eat it. Really fascinating. Let's see what else is out there. There's spotted bats. There's bats with really big ears. There's bats that can hover. There's nectar feeding bats that basically are nighttime hummingbirds. I mean, I'm going to say a non-specific number, but I say it for a reason. There are almost 1,500 species of bat in the world, which is the second most diverse order of mammals, second to rodents. And I say that it's non-specific. I say almost 1,500 because basically every day it changes. There are people discovering new bats all the time. And eventually when that number passes 1,500, we'll throw a little party and, move on, because in then 5 days, it's going to be, 1,510.
This is a challenge, actually, for Wild Kingdom, because we care a lot about bats and we care a lot about species diversity. So we might have 1,500 episodes in our future, all on a different kind of bat.
How many might we find just in the United States alone?
In the United States, I believe there are 47.
Peter and I have some bat cave experience now, thanks to you and your colleagues in Texas and the episode that we filmed. And you have been going into bat caves for years now. I mean, it's how you study these bats. What was different about the bat cave you and I went into and what we saw there versus some of the other caves that you've been in?
The biggest thing about that cave, the Gorman Cave in Central Texas, is that I had been in that cave before when it was absolutely packed full of animals. And you go into the main room where the maternity roost is supposed to be, and the bats are immediately flying around, and their wing flaps and the way they're moving air inside of that closed room, the only way you can really describe it is thunderous. They are just... It's really an experience, and I'm very sad that you didn't get to see it. But that's really what struck me, is that there should have been huge clusters of animals in there, and there really were not. And I had, unfortunately, that is similar experience when you're a white nose syndrome researcher like me. That experience is pretty common these days, where you go into a cave and you expect to see a bunch of bats and there are no bats, or you go in there and there are a bunch of dead bats on the floor, which is arguably a lot worse than seeing no bats, because if you don't see them, then you can hope that they're still alive somewhere. So I was very struck by that, and I think it came through in the episode quite a bit. And I'll tell you this, that we went back to that site later, and there were more bats than there were when we saw them. I don't know, there was like maybe 300 or 400 animals that came out.
Oh, that's a big difference. That's a big difference.
It's a big difference. But at the same time, 5 years ago, that cave had 18,000 animals in it.
5 years ago. My goodness.
That's drastic. Yeah.
Exactly. And so if you go down to 500, That's not a natural variation. That's something that bats can't even really recover from in our lifetime. Maybe the populations will recover. I don't know, but it sounds like white nose isn't getting better.
Nate, is there a possibility that there's a way to treat white nose syndrome in the near future?
It's possible. There are treatments available. There are people who have done a lot of work on developing, evaluating, and testing treatments on bats, both in the lab and in the wild. There's work that you can do where you're spraying a volatile organic compound that treats both the bats and the walls of the site. There's a vaccine in development that has a little bit of promise to it. But in general, all of these things, yes, maybe they can work. And I'm very encouraged by some of the results that we see. But at the same time, it's really hard to scale it. It's really hard to figure out how you're going to distribute this treatment at scale to a point where you've treated, I don't know, 95, 98% of the population. And that's what you need to do to help slow down white nose syndrome. It will definitely take time and it will definitely take patience. And unfortunately, it's very hard to do that when there are now discussions of listing some bats as endangered species because of white nose syndrome.
Now, Nate, okay, bats are nocturnal, right? And human beings are diurnal, right? So we don't interact with bats very much just because we are out and about at different times of the day. And so it's leading me to wonder, can you tell us a little bit more about where bats are found? I mean, let's take the United States, for example. And one reason I'm asking is because I lived in New York City for quite a while. And this was probably about 10 years ago. I was in Midtown Manhattan, and it was like dusk. And I was headed down into the subway, and it was busy. It was rush hour, and I was just going fast down the stairs. And there was what looked like a crumpled up leaf on the steps of the subway. And I thought to myself, I don't know if that's a leaf. And I crouched down and there were people yelling at me because I was going slow. And I got a really good look and it was a bat. So when it comes to the US, I mean, where can people find bats? Is it everywhere?
Yes, it actually is.
Easy answer.
Yeah, I have a similar story where I was in graduate school in Boston. I was, I could see Fenway Park from my office. And every year in the spring, I would get a call from somebody saying, there's a bat on the sidewalk outside. And I would be like, okay, well, I will, because I have rabies shots. I know how to handle a bat and all that kind of stuff. So I would run downstairs, I'd grab the bat, I'd put it in a bag, and I'd set it up to make sure it's doing okay, offer it some water, maybe offer it a mealworm or two. And then by the time night comes around, you take it out and you let it go and it flies away and it goes and does its thing. So you probably ran into a big brown bat, which are probably some of the most cosmopolitan bats that we have. They live actually everywhere.
Okay, so they can be New Yorkers too.
They can be, yeah. There's, of course, different diversity hotspots where you'll find more bats and fewer bats. So in the Northeast, there's maybe about 9 species of bats that you can encounter. Whereas when you go down to Texas or Arizona, you're talking about 20 to 30 species of bats that you can encounter. And it has to do with the environment that's available, the different ecosystems that are intersecting. I mean, Texas, for example, we'll just say this. You've got the eastern swamp species that are coming in. You've got the western mountain species that are coming in. You've got southern Mexican species and northern Great Plains species. You have this cool nexus of habitats, which means that you have a cool nexus of biodiversity. And it's not just in bats, but of course, that's what we're here talking about. So basically, wherever you are, there are bats.
Nate, it does sound like they're incredibly adaptable.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about climate change? Is that something you think over time you can hypothesize they might adapt to?
Yeah. Oh, boy. That's a big one. And it always is the big question. Can bats adapt to climate change? And there's some interesting ways to think about it in terms of, so hibernation, for example. The temperature inside of a cave sort of reflects the mean annual surface temperature of the environment outside the cave. So now you have a warmer cave when climate change really kind of takes hold. And I've had a lot of people say, well, if a cave is warm, isn't that good for bats because aren't they avoiding the cold?
They need to keep warm.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But Actually, you need to think about it in the reverse, because the reason why bats hibernate, the reason why bats go in caves where it's a stable temperature, is because they're trying to stay cold. Because if they can drop their body temperature down to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, that means they save more energy. If the average temperature inside that cave is now 60, they're burning 10 more degrees worth of body temperature in calories over time. So climate change makes hibernation harder to survive for a lot of animals, because maybe the insect populations don't respond in the same way, and bats will emerge from hibernation too early and not have the insects they need to survive on. Same with birds coming back too early when they migrate.
Okay, so I gotta ask now, if someone encounters a bat, and maybe we can talk about different scenarios, but what should they do? If there's a bat in your home, what should you do? And then if you find a bat, if, just out in the world, maybe injured or something, what do you advise people do?
Typically, if you find a bat in the daytime on the ground acting strange, it could be rabid and you don't want to interact with it. So if you find a bat outside, just don't mess with it. It'll either be fine or it's sick, and you don't need to mess with it in either case. If there's a bat in your house, the best thing you can do is isolate that bat in a room and open up all the windows, and it'll find its way out. Typically, they find their way out fairly quickly. If it's in a spot where you can't do that, put on some heavy gloves, get a shoebox, try to scoop it up in the shoebox, put the lid on, take it outside, put it on the ground, open it up, and the bat can find its way out. Gloves are important. Don't touch the animal barehanded. If it bites you, go to the doctor.
Now, Nate, for people like me that like having bats around, I've read quite a bit about bat houses.
Ooh.
What do you think about those? Do you recommend people to put those in their yard?
Yeah. So a bat house is just it's made out of plywood. People are now making them out of composite materials. They're just a roosting structure that are man-made that bats can hang out in. It's like a duck box or a bluebird box or any of that kind of stuff. If the bat box is well made and well placed, they can provide good habitat for bats. On the opposite side of that, if a bat box is poorly made and put in the wrong spot, it may not be inhabited by bats, or at worst, it could actually harm bats by being too hot, and that can eventually kill pups or cause bats. Bats are really good at getting cold. As we talked about with hibernation, bats are not good at getting hot. So once they get too warm, then they're pretty close to dying very quickly. So we try not to overheat them. So a bat box needs to be set up such that it can be warm but not too warm. And so if you're in the Northeast, for example, you want to paint the box black and actually put it out in the middle of a field with south-facing exposure. If you are in the South, you want to paint it more of a beige color and put it somewhere that it maybe gets some afternoon shade.
This is leading me to think about something else. And again, it relates back to the really exciting episode we filmed of season 1 for Wild Kingdom, Protecting the Wild. We found bats not in bat boxes, not in caves, but under a bridge in the middle of Austin, Texas.
Congress Avenue Bridge is a really special place. It's the largest urban bat colony in the world. This is the place where bats and humans have more interaction than anywhere on the planet. This is a wonderful example to the rest of the world how humans and wildlife can coexist.
The bridge in Austin is one of the biggest success stories in bat conservation, where when the bats first moved in, people were aghast. They wanted them out of there. They wanted them exterminated or removed or whatever. And through lots of work by really dedicated bat biologists, they managed to keep the population there and convince the city that they should live alongside the bats. And now it is one of the hottest tourism spots in the city. And it brings $10 million a year to Austin.
What a treat for us. Thanks, Nate.
I really appreciate it. I want to tell you guys that this was an absolute highlight of my career. I am never going to forget the experience I had with you in the cave, doing the whole process. It was so much fun. And this is a whole lot of fun too.
With white nose syndrome and threats to their environments, bats are currently experiencing a massive die-off. People like Nate Fuller are helping to learn more about this threat to bat populations in North America. Many people think bats are scary and dangerous, but like you heard today, bats are an important part of our environment. maintaining healthy bat populations and educating the public are key to helping these threatened species. If we protect wildlife and the environment today, we can ensure magical moments in the wild kingdom for future generations.
Join us next week when we speak with Nadia Seal about some incredible islands just off the coast of California.
You know, sometimes you can get caught up with the doom and gloom of media headlines, but it's so important to know that you have lights at the end of the tunnel. Know that you can move the needle in the right direction. It's one of those things where you see a species that might be going down and you can say, no, we can reverse that. We've done it before. We can do it again.
That's next time on Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, the podcast.
Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, the podcast, is a production of Pineapple Street Studios and Mutual of Omaha.
Our senior producer is Stephen Key. Producers are Zandra Ellen and Jenny Van Solen. Associate producer is Lisa Serda. Editor is Darby Maloney. Executive producers are Barry Finkel, Gabrielle Lewis, and Jen Wolfe. Pineapple's head of sound and engineering is Raj Makija. Senior audio engineers are Marina Pais, Davy Sumner, Javi Cruces, and Pedro Alvira. Additional engineering by Rob Miller and Jason Richards. This episode was mixed by Davy Sumner.
Production music courtesy of Epidemic Sound and Hearst Media Production Group.
Episode clips courtesy of Hearst Media Production Group. Fact-checking by Justine Dahm. Marketing and promotion by Emily Paschel. This podcast is hosted by me, Dr. Rae Grant.
And me, Peter Gross. A special thanks to Caitlin Williams, Sophie Radmilovich, and Stephanie Diaz.
Today's episode is based on the Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom series created by Don Meyer. Our next episode will be out in a week.
Make sure you listen on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts.